what is your position at AEI?
I'm the Director of Education Policy Studies.
Okay, thank you. And so the reason I wanted to interview today was to discuss this article that you co-authored recently with Brendan Bell, entitled "An Ivory Tower of Our Own." It was recently published in the quarterly journal National Affairs. And my first question is this. Throughout the article, you and Brendan Bell talk about higher education's influence on the culture. You even suggest that it has more of an impact on politics than even movies, music, television, literature. Why do you believe that's the case?
Well, I think it potentially does. It's hard to make comparisons.
Sure.
Look, I mean, universities are heavily subsidized, giant multi-billion-dollar conglomerates in the express business of producing, writing, and ideas. They wind up driving, driving conversations as far as what's getting written about, what's getting discussed, the policy proposals that are getting presented. They are critiquing literature, they're critiquing books. Folks who work at universities are many of the more influential pundits and combatants when it comes to various public debates. Look, it's one thing if you work in the movies or if you're a musician, you may have a platform if you're sufficiently successful to be able to weigh in on these things. But for a lot of people, you need a day job. And the reality is that if you have a day job at a university, you're able to get a check and you spend then all of your time writing and reading and doing research and weighing in on debates that you wish. And that makes them very powerful engines of culture.
How has this academic monoculture, as you call it, affected the culture?
I think anybody who has spent much time at research universities or colleges in general notices that there is a center of gravity, especially in the social sciences and humanities, which leans very heavily left ideologically. This means that many of the people who are writing about economics and sociology and education have a particular lean. These ideas have an impact on what is considered good practice in fields like education or public housing. It has an impact on what gets criticized and what doesn't get criticized. It has an impact on what kind of evidence is considered legitimate and serious in public debate. And so I think it winds up having a pretty unsurprising impact on some. One simple way to think about this is that 40 years ago, ideas like intersectionality and white privilege, as they're operationalized today, were something that was, these ideas were cultivated in obscure corners of the academy. I think part of the power of the academy is to note that these ideas are now at the very fulcrum of ongoing public debates. If you would like to go to graduate school and study school discipline, and your operating hypothesis is that a lack of discipline is bad for children, you're going to have trouble finding enthusiastic mentors in most schools of education. If your operating hypothesis is that religion and religious marriages are better for children than children raised in households that are not of faith, there's only a few programs where you're going to really find mentorship. Most of the academy has a general lean as far as the kinds of questions that are supported, the kinds of research that are encouraged. And there's not a conspiracy. That's the wrong way to think about it. It's that what we have created is a set of institutions that share a monoculture, and that through various gateways, who gets admitted to graduate school, who gets funded in graduate school, who gets hired for assistant professorial jobs, who gets tenure, who sits on the review boards of the major journals, who gets published in those journals. That what we have seen over time is a process that is relatively inhospitable to people who start with conservative priors and much more hospitable to people who start with progressive priors. And so we wind up with an academy which is self-reinforcing. One way to try to combat that is to try to start programs, at various institutions. Robbie George's shop at Princeton, what they've done at George Mason. And that's great. I'm entirely in favor of that. We should do more of that. The problem is that somebody like Robbie George has testified, is that you are still an island in a relatively hostile sea. It's not like the board of governors of these institutions is excited about what these conservative outposts are doing. It's not like they are surrounded by colleagues who are interested in mentoring and nurturing their graduate students and helping them learn the skills and achieve professional success. And frankly, it's not like I'm not all that interested in conservative outposts per se. I mean, those are good too. That's great. But what I'm actually interested in is research institutions where people who want to challenge the orthodoxy are free to go where their queries lead them. And the reality is that it's hard to do that when you are an appendage to a larger inhospitable institution. So what does that suggest? It suggests that there's real value in creating new institutions that are explicitly organized around this premise, that have boards that buy into it, that have endowments large enough to allow them to succeed, and that if they start to get their feet under them, they then can change the ecosystem by creating new opportunities as far as professorships, as far as housing centers and journals, as far as creating opportunities for graduate study. So really, as far as starting to create a much more diverse community of elite institutions, which are engaged in the work of culture. Because I understand that, when we said at the beginning that I believe higher ed has can be a very powerful force of culture, we're not talking about most of the 4,000 or 5,000 institutions out there. We're not talking about community colleges and regional institutions that are mostly interested in making a buck by credentialing people. What we're talking about is the 75 or 175 elite institutions, which are almost uniformly on the left, and even a couple of institutions that had a different orienting philosophy could potentially have a huge marginal impact given that landscape. One of the interesting things is hard sciences are obviously a huge engine of elite research universities. And I said 75 or 175, that's generous. If we think about research one institutions, there's only about 60 in the whole United States. And these institutions are heavily subsidized by the US government, 40 billion to higher ed just in research alone, not counting the 150 billion in federal, say, student aid and the rest, student lending. So look, what we're talking about is a set of institutions that are heavily dependent on aid. A huge part of these institutions' prestige and ability to generate revenue lies in the hard sciences, in math. But the reality is these folks both tend to be more centrist than higher education faculty as a whole, and they tend to keep their heads down in the campus wars. They don't want to have anything to do with this stuff. It's a distraction. They don't see it as their problem, which is one reason why faculty governance, like so many things nowadays, seems to be dominated by the most radical elements. It's because the people who don't have a taste for this want to keep their heads down and not get caught up in the crossfire. So there's two things. One, I'd like to see changes, I've written about in other contexts, that we give the hard science faculty more interest in trying to temper and moderate their colleagues. So for instance, making institutions which violate free inquiry standards no longer eligible for federal research funding, because I think that would obviously give hard scientists skin in the game. But more fundamentally, the new institution or institutions we're talking about, that would be less their mission. The places where ideology matters most are those that where the standards are most subjective. So obviously, simply because you're trying to build a university that is both coherent, that can offer a cohesive learning experience, I think it's appropriate to have those departments as part of the institution. But the central mission should very explicitly be in the humanities and social sciences and associated professional schools.
Hillsdale or Grove City, how do they differ from the model that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I love Hillsdale. Hillsdale's a wonderful place. Hillsdale is very much a teaching institution. On the left, you think of its counterparts as places like Oberlin and Swarthmore, which are highly respected, which are wonderful places for people to go to school when they're looking for that kind of experience. But Hillsdale actually asks its professors to teach. They work hard. They actually have real day jobs. In order to, and we have seen nonetheless, both the president of Hillsdale and obviously individual faculty make wonderful contributions to the intellectual to the intellectual discourse. But it's not their primary job. The people for whom it's their primary job are the people who teach one course a semester, who have several talented young doctoral students at their disposal, who have an institution which is set up to attract large grant funding and to support those kinds of things with all of the scaffolding and staff, so that those researchers are themselves not simply people writing an essay, but are actually the heads of research enterprises, collecting data, making sense of that data, training disciples, and thus having an outsized impact on, who sits at institutions and who sits on review boards and what gets considered to be knowledge. And that is simply a charge that's larger than a teaching institution is really designed. That's a weight that's heavier than a teaching institution is really designed to carry.
Tell me more about the nuts and bolts behind your model. You spend a good portion of the essay breaking down and calculating costs, estimating. You estimate that it'll be perhaps around $3.4 billion, perhaps less. But you don't question whether such an undertaking is possible. But you rather that there are likely donors who would be more than happy to participate in this undertaking. Instead, you ask the real question is whether should it be done, and you anticipate some objections and offer some answers. So make the case, I suppose.
Sure. I mean, the first question is, can this be done? And one of the things that many folks who haven't spent much time thinking about higher ed history may not know is that new institutional formation used to be normal in American higher ed. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, it was routine to see 10, 15 new institutions born a year. Places that we today think of as forever. Johns Hopkins, University of Rochester, University of Chicago, were born out of somebody writing a check. You go back far enough, by the way, that's how Harvard and Yale, those guys got started too. So part of what's happened is over the last 50 or 70 years, as the higher ed space has matured, the existing institutions have gotten very good at having their fundraisers go to potential donors and say, you've got 50 million you'd like to give. Wouldn't you love to build a bioethics program at Caltech and even conservative funders who are skeptical of higher ed writ large and who are frustrated by what's happened have gotten in the habit of saying, well, okay, I can at least stand up something that I'm proud of, something that's good. And they've just, I think, frequently not bothered to wring their hands over whether or not this is eventually going to get captured, whether it's just putting more money and more staff in the service of institutions which are hostile to their fundamental views and values. So that's part of it. Second question is, all right, even if you can spend money on a university like this, is it even feasible? Can you really start a new university and it would become Hopkins or Chicago and had that kind of impact. Because it took Hopkins better part of at least half a century to become the Hopkins as we really think of it today. But the answer is sure. NYU, for instance, was a commuter college not that long ago. Wash U, which is today an elite research institution that collects buckets of federal research dollars, used to have to work very hard to distinguish itself. And people know it wasn't in Washington State. So it turns out that programs for well under $1 billion, existing institutions with targeted fundraising and disciplined leadership have been able to move themselves from the nobody ever talks about them also rans into top 25, top 30 institutions in a span of less than 20 years. So, if you're talking about something that's going to make a difference in the popular culture in 2023, no, this is not a useful solution. If you're talking about something that might maybe making a difference by 2035, 2040, and you think that's important, and I do, I think it's not unreasonable. Yeah, we came up with this cost of $3.5 billion, give or take, by saying, look, let's assume that you're actually going to build a university which looks a lot like a classic Research One institution. There's reasons not to do that. You can do online learning in ways that would create huge cost savings. But the problems with those is, one, what you're trying to do is create a cultural influencer. And there is a see and taste and cohesion and familiarity factor to the kinds of institutions that are regarded as belonging, their research belongs on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. Their scholars' summations of evidence belong on the editorial pages of USA Today and Washington Post. There's a reason that when you see professors wind up there, they're disproportionately from the same 40 or 50 places, because those places. So that's part of it. A second part of it is what we're actually trying to do is create something that can incubate an ecosystem. We want a place where talented, research-minded young scholars who want to challenge the monoculture can actually go get mentored, can go forge relationships, can feel comfortable. Can't do that virtually. What we want is something which will create a steady pipeline of young scholars who will leave with enough publications and enough support and enough training and enough relationships that perhaps they can actually successfully make that jump into some of these other institutions and diversify them, especially if these other institutions are feeling pressure. If we make them feel pressured to actually be interested in intellectual heterogeneity. So by the time you figure out what it costs to buy 500 acres on the outskirts of Houston or Atlanta, to build the buildings to house a few thousand students and a few thousand graduate students, to build a faculty where you're paying top of the market rates so that you can actually recruit and offer faculty to a stand-up enterprise like this, where you're taking on the usual costs in terms of campus support systems, but trying to appropriately downsize them given how bloated they've become in recent decades. By the time you do all this together, I try to make sure that you've got lucrative fellowships for your doctoral students, have in-house research funding, have the necessary supports, have the library system, and then have an endowment that can actually carry this thing in perpetuity once it's up and running. The total price tag is $3.5 billion, to which there have been two general reactions. One, that's a ton of money. The other is, holy cow, that's all it would cost? Because obviously there are folks, there are conservatives who are hugely frustrated with higher education, who are capable individually of giving lead gifts that would account for 10 or 20 or 30% of that total amount. Should it be done? One argument is that if you do this, you reduce the pressure on other higher ed institutions to actually be diverse, intellectually diverse. I don't have a lot of patience for that argument. Anybody who thinks that elite institutions spend a lot of time worrying about being ideologically inclusive has not spent much time at these places, to my mind. A second is obviously the concern that, like so many higher institutions, an institution like this would eventually get captured. It would exist in a higher ed space. Whoever you started with the board, whoever started in the chancellor's in the president's office, would eventually go south. I'm not so sure. I think we've seen institutions ranging from Hillsdale to the National Review, which have been outsized contributors to AEI, where I work, to the Martin Center, where you work, where I think we've seen places make substantial intellectual contributions, where I think they've shown they can remain true to their roots, where rather than sucking up all the construction space, they've actually been engines for cultivating young talent and pushing folks out in the world in a way that has created a richer ecosystem of thought than would otherwise be the case. I'm willing to bet that the odds, I'm comfortable, the world's an uncertain place, but I'm comfortable that the odds are good enough that it would work out that way rather than some other way. But honestly, that's why I would love to see 4 of these rather than 1 of these. I think the biggest piece, though, I think, is, reasonable people can quibble with the pricing, can quibble with the operationalization of the idea, can quibble with it. That's fine. The main thing, I think, is that those of us who believe campuses have an obligation to be places of free inquiry, have an obligation to be places where we enrich the culture and don't just reiterate a party line of the monoculture, have an obligation to do more than play defense. Like I said, I think what FIRE has done is critical and important work. I'm a huge fan. But they'll be the first people to say, look, they're in the business of trying to protect a basket of crucial civil liberties. They're not trying to offer a higher ed agenda. So here is one piece, I think, one actionable, potentially promising piece of a vision of how do we actually start to change the landscape. And if not this, I would just put to people, okay, but what else?
Thank you so much for speaking today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to be with you.